There you go.
All right, everyone. So welcome to our Slice of Social Justice. How about the protest, the pandemic, and racial justice, and how disasters shape social change? Our speakers for today are going to be Dr. Jordan Pascoe, who's one of our own faculty. She's an associate professor of philosophy, critical race and ethnicity studies, and women and gender studies at Manhattan College. Mitch Stripling is public health emergency manager with more than 16 years of experience across the country. He's responded to more than a dozen federally declared disaster and is the former assistant commissioner for agency preparedness or response at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. They both had an article come out in the pandemic in the Kennedy Institute for Bioethics Journal in June, and now they're both working on a book about the social epistemology of disasters. And I will leave the Google Meet stage to you.
Great. Thank you. We're excited to have you all here. We're excited to be back for Slice of Social Justice. We have done Slices of Social Justice, I think, about Hurricane Sandy, about Hurricanes Maria and Irene. Hurricane Maria?
They all run together.
They all run together. We're not sure. We can't tell the hurricanes apart anymore.
It's hard.
So anyway, we're excited to be back. We want to acknowledge up front that covering this pandemic and the protests in an hour is a lot. So we're going to do a little bit of a gloss here in order to have some time for questions so we can hopefully open it up for a discussion. So with that in mind, I want to give Mitch the chance to start us off, and we're going to kind of go back and forth and build out a little bit of how we're thinking about this.
And we'll make sure that there's time for questions at the end. So feel free to kind of either queue them up in the chat or just have them ready when we get there. So let me start off with a little bit of a background on COVID-19. I think it's been dominating the news cycle long enough that I won't go too deep in it, but I want to point out a few things that really lean into the social change aspects of it. So when COVID-19 started in this country back in February, March, one of the first things that we noticed about it as public health experts were that the outcomes from it were really inequitable. We've talked a lot about outcomes being inequitable based on age. Older people are more vulnerable. People with pre-existing conditions are more vulnerable. But it's also been really inequitable across the lines of race and ethnicity. In particular, Black folks, Indigenous folks have much higher rates of morbidity and mortality. And when you look at that, that is because they have less access to healthcare and they have less of a public health infrastructure in the areas where they live. And that was really clear really early on, although it wasn't a substantial part of the messaging that came out about it in the country. Now, as COVID came in, there are a couple of other pieces that kind of lean into our social justice angle, okay? One piece is that it started on the coast and then it sort of moved inland. So if you remember that at first it was urban areas on the coast that were hit with COVID early on, and that fueled this initial narrative that was both sort of racially charged and also charged sort of against urban areas, right? Urban areas were seen to be the places where the pandemic was spreading. Now that changed, but that fueled a lot of the initial narrative about it. So let's talk about some social justice touch points. If you remember, the first protests that happened during COVID were actually protests against the masking and social distancing measures that were put in place. Now, as a public health expert, I want to be clear with everybody because there's been so much confusion. People were asked to wear cloth face coverings and still are, not to protect yourself, but to protect other people around you. So the question of wearing a mask isn't, are you worried, right? Are you worried and thus you should wear a cloth face covering because of your worry? You're wearing a cloth face covering because you are trying to take care of other people around you who you might infect without knowing that you have COVID. And that logic is really difficult to look at from a civil liberties perspective. So the first protests we saw were anti-mask protests, and they were fueled by people who were making a civil liberties argument. You can't tell me what to do. Wearing a mask gets in the way of my rights. And it turns out that many of them, the Brookings Institution did a deep dive study of this. Many of those initial anti-mask protests were actually funded by anti-gun lobby groups who used their Second Amendment lobbying to fuel pro-gun. Did I say anti-gun? Yes. Okay, I get those confused sometimes. Those positions. They sort of used their Second Amendment logic, the right to bear arms, to say you cannot infringe on my rights by making me do this thing that will care for other people. So those kind of logics intersected each other. So we'll come back to that later. Then the second touch point that I want to talk about is then the George Floyd protests that erupted after his killing by cops in Minneapolis. And I want to dive into this because it really shows how it's connected to COVID. You can't really see these things without looking at them together. So why is that? So by May, you have a population that has been in isolation for an extended period of time under social distancing efforts that can't socialize, and you have a growing polarization in the country because of these kind of anti-mask protests. You have to layer on top of that the inequitable outcomes in morbidity and mortality. By that point in May, the death rate in the African American population was at a level of about 1 every 1,500 Black folks in the country had died from COVID. It's an astounding statistic. If you look at by the end of this year, it could be 1 out of 1,000. That death rate is so much higher than the death rate in the white population that it's sometimes unbelievable. The rate is something like 400% as high, and it's even higher in indigenous populations. So that fueled this incredible tension about the sort of racial disparities in the COVID response. And all of that tension was sort of there and waiting. So when the killing of George Floyd happened, yes, it certainly built on a legacy of protests against unfair treatment by police that had been growing since Ferguson and before that, but it was also infected by this energy from the pandemic response itself. And that helped to make it a rapid global phenomenon. So I want to note 2 things that happened in those early days in Minneapolis in particular, after the killing of George Floyd and the protests that erupted after the body cam footage came out. Number 1 was that the logic of the protests themselves were generally in line with the logic of the public health response. That is, we can talk a lot about what happened at the fringes of those protests, but by and large, the protests were good on social distancing. They were good on mask usage. They were good on hand sanitizers. The protests were done by people who were protesting in spite of their fear of COVID. Oftentimes people who had had loved ones who had gotten really sick and died. There have been public health studies that have shown that the more affected you were by COVID, the more likely you were to protest. And also that, and we have really good epi data on this. I know there's been a lot of conflicting stuff in the news, but epidemiologically, there were no COVID spikes based on the protests because they were outdoors, and they had good infection control practices. So the logic of the protests, it turned out, had something like a safety effect. The cities where there were more Black Lives Matter protests had a lower case fatality rate than COVID, not a higher one. And we saw that starting in Minneapolis and to all the places the protests happened. But there was another current that happened right after that too, which I'm going to just tell as the story of Umbrella Man, which is in those early days after the protests, when violence was happening, there was a man with an umbrella that started the window breaking in Minneapolis, who started some of the violence that was there. And it turned out he was coming from some of these far-right groups that had been protesting against the pandemic and was there to create violence and to stir up rage and conflict. Now, the reason that's important is not to say that he was the only one who committed any violence or anything like that. But what you see in disasters is this logic goes both ways after any disaster, after a Sandy or a Katrina or something like that. When you're in the disaster long enough, you start to want to work with other people towards change in your community because you see some of the underlying problems in it. And at the same time, there's a reaction against that in society where people want to push back nostalgically to the way things were before. Both of these trends start after disasters. and they lead to different places. Sometimes they lead to change, sometimes they don't. But the chaos of the disaster stirs all that up in the air. So that's my kind of breakdown of what happened, some of the social justice touch points we saw early on in the pandemic. The question is sort of why, what's going on underneath that from a theoretical perspective?
Which, is obviously where I come in. So part of how Mitch and I are trying to think about disaster is we're trying to think about the both the ethical and also the epistemic practices that emerge through disaster. And we want to argue that the pandemic is really useful for understanding how disasters work, partly because it is global, right? So you get to see it everywhere. There's no escape from this disaster. And partly because the nature of a pandemic is that it's just really extended, right? So the kinds of trends that you would see emerge over days or weeks in something like a hurricane or wildfires, we're seeing play out over months. So the way that this breaks down becomes clearer. So here's what we know. The sociology of disasters has found that one of the most powerful ways that disasters create social change is that they change our perceptions. Right? They make us more aware of our vulnerability. They make us more aware of our interconnectedness with each other. And they therefore orient us towards wanting to act in community with others. Disaster psychologists have found that there's something like a crowd psychology that happens after disaster, where people understand their own survival as hinging on the survival of others, right? And so they start wanting to act together, right? And think together and work together. And it's worth noting that this story about the way that we think of ourselves as interconnected in disasters runs against many of our kind of dominant beliefs about the ethics of disasters, right? These kind of mainstream stories, everyone's in a Hobbesian state of nature, just out for themselves, you know what I mean, looting and fighting and so on and so forth. The sociology suggests the opposite is true. People tend to come together and create emergent communities to solve problems, to help one another survive, and to build community networks to survive disasters. Now, the issue is, right, that in most disasters, this doesn't last very long. It doesn't last very long for a whole bunch of reasons. Partly there's compassion fatigue. And partly it's because when the official response starts up, when the state comes in and starts deploying FEMA stuff, right, people get frustrated by the ways that that's disrupting their community networks. They get tired. They get frustrated by the failures of the response, and they go home, right? Now, this is also complicated, right? So the other piece of this we've got to add on is that in a disaster like a wildfire or a hurricane, part of what happens is the disaster hits and everyone is evacuating. Everyone's running out of their homes. They're forming emergent communities of solidarity in real space, in real time. Right? But in a pandemic, this is frustrated, right? In a pandemic, we have this urge to want to be together while we are asked continuously to stay apart, right? We have this desire to work together while we are asked to isolate from even the people closest to us. And so part of our argument is that the pandemic has two significant impacts immediately on disaster survivors, right? And all of us here are disaster survivors. The first one is that we have this moral frustration. We want to stand together. We want to help each other, and we can't. And we have a real distress about that, right? So there's an urge to stand together that's frustrated by the nature of the pandemic. The second is that our perceptions shifted, right? All of the racialized impacts that Mitch described, all of the ways that our institutions and political structures failed us across the board, created a collective perceptual awareness, right? A new awareness of the weaknesses of our institutions, the brittleness of our institutions, the ways in which our institutions don't actually work for us, which makes visible to us the ways that they don't work for others, right? And so all of this is to say, right, all of this is mapping why it might be that people were ready, when the George Floyd video went viral, why there was this kind of cumulative global action in response. Part of it is this perceptual shift, which we'll talk more about. And part of this is this moral frustration because of the urge to solidarity that happens in all disasters, but is frustrated by the nature of the pandemic. Now, I think it's also important to note, and Mitch laid this out really nicely, that the politics of the pandemic, right? The anti-mask protests, the George Floyd protests, the narratives about the dangers of the urban centers on the coasts versus what's happening in the center of the country. All of that is mapping onto existent political stories, existent perceptual practices, and existent kind of like moral assumptions that we make about the world, right? So, for example, if you look at the geography of places that have been very happy to wear masks, or, no one's happy to wear a mask, except for possibly Connor with his awesome masks that we saw earlier, right? But places that are resistant to mask wearing, places that are pro-mask wearing, one of the things you'll notice is that they basically track gun laws. Right? Places with high gun control laws tend to be more willing to wear masks. Places with conceal and carry laws tend to be places where there are fewer mask ordinances. And part of this is about the already existent moral practices on the ground, right? If you live in a place where people are allowed to carry weapons on their person, you live in a place where people are allowed to pose risks to one another in public spaces. Right? You live in a place where everyone assumes that those risks are worth bearing in the name of your civil liberties. And so therefore, wearing masks would violate your assumption about the priority of civil liberties. And likewise, if you live in a place, like New York City with very, very strong gun laws, we tend to think that it's not okay to pose those kinds of risks to one another in public. And so wearing masks tracks those beliefs. Right. So you've got two things, right? You've got the moral assumptions, right? The moral frameworks in place in different communities. And then on top of that, you've got these perceptual shifts as the disaster unfolds. Okay. So part of what happens in a disaster, right? One way to understand what a disaster is, right, is that in our understanding of disasters, we think of disasters as exceptional circumstances, right? We're allowed to have exceptional response mechanisms, sort of exceptional political powers, exceptional aid networks, because disasters are exceptional. And that idea of exceptionality, you'll notice, right? Disasters are sort of like, well, everything broke, and that is exceptional because normally everything works. Right? So notice that calling a disaster exceptional is simultaneously a claim that everything works in normal times, right? And the exceptional nature of disaster is what produces this drive to solidarity, right? We tend to understand solidarity as an exceptional condition in the United States, right? Not as like a normal feature of our social and political life, but as these mutual aid networks that spring up in disaster. And then when the disaster goes away, so do the mutual aid networks, right? But if you live in a community in which every day is a disaster, in which none of the institutions that are supposed to function do, in which the disaster is in a certain sense unexceptional because the institutions that the disaster breaks are already broken, then your perception of what a disaster might be are very, very different, right? And we saw this right, Mitch is describing the ways in which the George Floyd protests emerge aligned with the public health logics of the disaster. Right? In many ways, the George Floyd protests were wholly prepared to operate both as a kind of localized disaster response, right? A lot of the protests had COVID testing. They had people handing out masks before that was happening widely elsewhere. They had people handing out carefully bagged up food and water in order to protect people while also feeding them, while also supporting them. right? And this is because, right, the local community organizations who shaped those protests, right, the Movement for Black Lives organizations, Blackout Collective, the organizations on the ground in Minneapolis, in Seattle, in New York, in Portland, all over the country, are well practiced in this question of how to survive institutional failures, which on some level is what a disaster is, because those institutional failures mark their everyday experience, right? So communities shaped by this unrelenting disaster of the everyday tend to push beyond the kind of emergent forms of solidarity that we see in disasters, right? So solidarity here isn't just the solidarity of survival. It isn't just the solidarity of having a shared identity within the disaster or shared interests in surviving the disaster, in recovering from the disaster, in responding to the disaster. Communities shaped by everyday disaster tend to develop practices of what the philosopher Alexis Shotwell has called aspirational solidarity. So aspirational solidarity is a form of solidarity that assumes that the current world in which we live is not working for us, and that the work of solidarity is to envision and birth a new world. And it is organized not through shared experiences or interests, but through the collective development of a shared commitment to the future, right? It is the work of envisioning and birthing a new world, and the ongoing work of working towards that world across various differences, building coalitions in order to get there. It maps the normal order of things as already untenable and apocalyptic. And part of what we're arguing, right, is that so that kind of aspirational solidarity can emerge in any community that maps the normal order of things as untenable and apocalyptic and wants to envision and birth a new world, right? So this tends to happen in marginalized communities who are already being failed by our institutions. Here's what happens in the disaster. The rest of us get a glimpse of that. The rest of us have this moment, right, where we see our institutions failing us too, right? We see schools shuttering. We see our healthcare system failing us. We see our governments failing to provide, funding, failing to provide support for the unemployed, failing to surge access to PPE and medical care and so on and so forth. And that glimpse of the failure of the normal order of things opens the door to the possibility of a broader aspirational solidarity. So our argument is that what happens in the George Floyd protests is a combination of two things working that are working themselves together in ways that have the potential to be really socially transformative. On the one hand, you have Black-led organizations who have been doing this work of aspirational solidarity in the face of persistent institutional failure for years, right? Who bring to disasters a lovingly held, coherently argued vision of a possible world, right? And you have that at the moment at which people are desperate for a new vision of a possible world, and in which their own epistemic practices, their own understanding of the world has been shaken enough that they're open to it in a way that they might not have been otherwise, right? So you've got all of these people, and let's note, the George Floyd protests were unprecedented in their global size, scale, and the speed with which they spread. They were also unprecedented in the number of white people who were involved in Movement for Black Lives protests. They produced other kinds of unprecedented shifts, right? Like the explosion of anti-racist literature on the New York Times bestseller list. So part of what we're seeing happening is people have this perceptual shift, which creates this openness to new ways of seeing. this moral frustration, right? You want to be in solidarity because it's a disaster, but it's a pandemic, so you're stuck in your house watching everything on the screen, right? And you have those things making visible the failures of our institution, not just for you, but for the communities hardest hit by the pandemic. And this produces an ability to see, and in fact, an ability to know in new ways, right? Lots of people have been like, all right, white people, like, what took you so long to get here? Like, we're happy you're here, but what took you so long? Right. And so part of what Mitch and I really want to draw out here is the way in which the pandemic produces the possibility of this kind of perceptual shift and can therefore build these coalitions of aspirational solidarity.
So now I have to be the downer. So uniquely, United States disaster response and recovery frameworks are designed to work against this idea of aspirational solidarity. My first job in public health disaster response was after Hurricane Charlie in Florida in 2004, and the job was to shut down communal food establishments. So after the hurricane, people had come together to share food with each other because their refrigerators weren't working, and there were these big parties where people were sharing and helping people get food. And my disaster response team shut them down for food safety reasons. But also by doing that, we kind of shut down this communal solidarity that Jordan's talking about. And that is built into the United States disaster response frameworks in unique ways. Other countries have disaster response frameworks that are built on a universal human rights and responsibility framework that sort of say, okay, after a disaster, we need to make sure everybody gets to this level, right? Everybody's okay, they have what they need. And ours aren't. Ours are based on, we will recover you to where you were before the disaster. And you can see how those things are different. Other countries in the United Nations, you can have laid out frameworks which attempt to use the solidarity that comes in disasters towards raising the general equity of the society, right? But in the United States, our disaster recovery frameworks are built towards establishing whatever was in place before and getting us back to that level. And interestingly, this is built into the social safety net of the country as well. Michelle Dauber, who's a political historian, traced the New Deal, which started a lot of what we know of as the welfare state today. In other countries, in Europe and other places like that, their welfare states were based on this idea of making sure everyone had a certain level of access to these goods. Ours weren't, actually. If you look at the New Deal and how it was passed, it was based on a disaster relief idea. What's in the legislation says, if you go back to the earliest days of our country, we've always helped people get back on their feet when they've fallen on hard times. So we should install a welfare state as a permanent disaster relief to make sure that if somebody falls on hard times, they can recover and get back to where they were before. So built into the logic of the social safety net in our country is that we will never try to raise anyone towards equity. We will never try to get everybody a fair shake. We will look at where they started, and if they fall below that, we will help them get back to that point. And if you think about it, those are two incredibly different logics in play, right? Because what that means is the social safety net will never change anything structurally built into society, right? If you were born poor, totally fine for you to stay poor. And but if you were rich and you became poor, well, you know what? We're going to help you get rich again. That's kind of what's built into that logic. Now, the way we see it in the pandemic or in other disasters, because we've seen this play out over and over again, is that these emergent norms that Jordan talked about come into place and people feel them really powerfully. But the way the disaster recovery frameworks are designed, they are designed to try to make that energy go away. And they do that by making sure that they sort of serve the kind of swing folks that are there, right? All these extra folk, Jordan said it was all the white people coming to protest, whatever it is, the people that were being well served by the society before the disaster. The disaster recovery frameworks are there to make sure they feel well served again, and to kind of draw off their solidarity, right? The pitch is, listen, I'm going to give you your FEMA money to restore your house. You're going to feel better about it. And then you'll kind of stop protesting because we're going to make the system working for you again. It's built into FEMA disaster assistance because you only get individual assistance to recover whatever was lost. If you had a house worth $5 million, you'll get $5 million. If your house was worth $500, that's all the help you're going to get too. So there's kind of no structural change. So the recovery frameworks try to stop any kind of nascent structural changes that are there. And what that means is that in a disaster, we usually see more conservative leadership than we saw before. Conservative just in the old school ways. We see people standing up and trying to lead in aggressive militaristic ways, because what the logic of the disaster is, let's go old school. Let's get things back the way they were before. And so that leads towards these kind of strong-armed authoritarian tendencies in disaster response. And that's true in any administration. Anybody that's running a disaster response from an institutional perspective always goes more aggressive and militaristic, and they start using battle metaphors. And part of that is because they are trying to lead the people listening to them back to the way things were before the disaster, whereas the community on the ground is moving towards this new vision. And you see that in a couple ways. Looting is a good example. Looting and violence. After every disaster, there is this story of massive looting and massive violence. We saw it after Hurricane Katrina, for example. There were all these stories after Katrina about looting and violence that were happening. When you looked at it a couple of years later, the victims of the disaster had not in generally looted, and the violence was really by people that were saying that they were defending their homes, and it turned out they were just murdering a lot of Black folks who were victims of the disaster. Like, that's what you get a couple of years after. But at the time, the narrative is, well, these survivors, there's this often racialized thing where the victims are going all savage, right? This state of nature thing that's happening. And that's not true. But what that is this nostalgic disaster response, a racialized disaster patriarchy leadership trying to kind of grab the disaster response and move it back to the past. So the thing I want to leave you with is there's this it's almost like a conceptual war that happens between the aspirational solidarity that Jordan is laying out, how we all kind of come together and move towards the future, and the recovery frameworks that are trying to kind of yank us back into the past before the pandemic happened. And in disasters, it can go a couple of ways. Sometimes a disaster leads to real social change. After Katrina, there were some improvements in disaster legislation, and that worked to the good. Other times, the disaster response reinforces those inequities that were there before and kind of hardens them and makes them worse. Right. So after Katrina, the public education system in New Orleans was by and large dismantled towards a set of charter schools that were funded by outside venture capitalists. Right. And that hardened in some of the inequities that were there. So it can go either way. You can think of it like a wave. Right. In a disaster, you've got this massive wave of aspirational solidarity that's kind of hitting up against a seawall or a beach that's the recovery frameworks that the society built, right? And so the question in every disaster, and the question for us right now is, how far does that wave go, right? At some point it hits and it's going to retract, and then the society will be maybe standing there but different. And what we don't know right now is how far the wave will go and what will change and what won't.
Okay. All right. So I want to just close this out. I want to come back to this idea that Mitch gave us, that part of what disaster response is designed to do is to like call us back, right? Is to be nostalgic. Now, he gave us the example of the school system in New Orleans after Katrina. And I know that a lot of you have read about that, right? In part because it's one of the primary examples that Naomi Klein uses in her account of disaster capitalism. How many of you are familiar with this idea of disaster capitalism, right? That part of how disasters produce long-lasting change is that in the chaos, it creates space for capitalists to kind of come in and shutter public programs, right? So if you look at New Orleans after Katrina, you get the shuttering of public housing projects, the shuttering of schools, you get the remaking of the city along these kinds of neoliberal lines. And often disaster capitalism is framed as a kind of innovative practice, We want to argue against that. We want to say that what disaster capitalism really is a kind of settler logic, right? It is a reenactment of settler colonialism. It is nostalgia, right? And likewise, Rachel Luft, who was a sociologist on the ground during Hurricane Katrina, argues that both at the level of government response, but also even at the level of many emergent community organizations on the ground, what we see alongside disaster capitalism is what Mitch referred to as racialized disaster patriarchy. That in other words, when we start to think, okay, well, what is normal? What is the normal world that we're like working our way back to? Part of what's built into our vision of normal is this racialized patriarchal nostalgia. Right? It is a world of normal in which the system serves white people. It is a world of normal in which men do the heavy lifting of responding to disaster. And you see this playing out even within emergent solidarity-based response networks on the ground. But let's notice we're seeing this in the pandemic too, right? The gendered impact of the pandemic needs to be addressed, as well as the raced impact and the way that those impacts intersect with one another so that the burdens of the pandemic are disproportionately falling on the shoulders of women of color, right? Who are being screwed over both by the shuttering of schools, which is having an impact on all working parents, but disproportionately on women, as well as the impacts of a racialized recession, a racialized pandemic impact, as well as the fact that the majority of essential workers are women of color. Right? So this racialized disaster patriarchy is a kind of collective willingness to recreate the world according to nostalgic logics. Right? And so part of what we want to argue is that this work of aspirational solidarity is the work of resisting this. It is the work of knowing the world through the perceptual shifts of disaster in a way that makes this nostalgic world seem undesirable, impossible. Like we don't want to go back there. We want something new, but we can only build that something new by standing in solidarity with groups who know how to do this. Right? So Luft, in her analysis of what happens in Katrina after New Orleans, looks at the way in which the emergent organizations on the ground, things like Common Grounds and the People's Hurricane Relief Fund, they were initiated by, they were formed by the Black Panther Party, who had been doing this work for generations in New Orleans as well as across the country. They knew how to build an emergency response network. But then even within those organizations, Black women found that they were being sidelined because of the way that patriarchal logics were operating within Black-led spaces, right? So again, this is all happening intersectionally. And so you get the emergence of Black feminist reproductive justice networks that emerge in New Orleans after Katrina, and that start to build this coalition of reproductive justice networks as both a form of healthcare and a form of community relief. And many of those organizations seed the community groups that become Black Lives Matter in the years, in the last 10 years. So you have this kind of map, right, of the ways in which existing resistant community organizations bring their aspirational visions to disaster response. Through that disaster, even more resistant visions are shaped, and those resistant visions are part of what seed and shape the community organizations that will be ready on the ground when the next disaster hits, right? So I want to just close this out. Part of how Mitch and I are thinking about disasters is we are borrowing a framework from Audre Lorde. In her poem, A Litany for Survival, she says, and I urge you to hear this in light of Mitch's analysis of disasters as operating like a kind of wave, right? She says, for those of us at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone, for those of us who cannot indulge in the passing dreams of choice, seeking a now that breeds futures. And so the question that Mitch and I are trying to ask about disasters through this sort of social, political, and also epistemological analysis is how do we understand disasters as this now that breeds futures, right? And now that has the potential to bring new worlds, new ways of being into being in the world, right? Rather than treating disasters as an inevitable opportunity for nostalgia, for a kind of snap back to where things were before. So I think that's what we wanted to say.
Yep.
So we are here for questions. I know that was a lot. We just threw like so much stuff at you guys. Sorry.
That's right.
We've only had each other to talk to for so long. We're so excited you guys are all here.
That's right. If it was incoherent, totally fine. We'll happy to unpack it some more.
Yeah. So. Okay, Robbie's got a question about gun funding. Oh, good.
Okay, so I see. Yeah. So the thing about it is the initial organizing that I was talking about. This is a question about anti-mass protests and their connection to the pro-gun lobby. Were by a set of gun rights groups who were really critical of the NRA. So they're like to the right of the NRA and feel like the NRA is too reasonable, right? And so in doing that work, it wasn't money so much as organizing talent that they gave. It was this group called, I think they're the Door Brothers. I forget the names of their group, but they run groups in several states. And so they used that infrastructure to seed those initial rallies, but it didn't take a lot of funding, right? And again, they were tapping into a current of frustration that was there already, right? I'm not saying that they kind of made that up, but they did sort of use their kind of sweat equity to get it moving. I don't know if that helped, but I will note that one thing that's happened in the last 4 years and happened in the pandemic was that we've actually seen an increase in gun buying in more liberal states. So during the last 4 years of the Obama administration, gun buying in more conservative states went up sharply. During the pandemic, it's actually been your Maine, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, like places like that that have been seeing increased weaponization.
Yeah, and most of them first-time gun buyers. There seemed to have been a massive rise in first-time gun buyers since the beginning of the pandemic, which happens a little bit in every disaster, but the pandemic's been going on a while, so people have had time to go get their gun on. Yeah. Other questions? Feel free to come on if you want to just ask something or put it in the chat. Either is there's good.
Hi, my name's Jocelyn. I'm a staff writer for the student-run newspaper, and I'm actually covering this for our newspaper, so I hope you don't mind that I've been recording. I can't wait to highlight this wonderful lecture for our student body. I was wondering if I could like virtually take a picture of you two together so we could use it for the paper.
Sure.
Thank you.
It's not awkward.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for covering it.
Yeah.
I guess.
Good.
What?
Yeah, Ashley's question about blurring lines and disrupting binaries. Yes, absolutely. In fact, in the full version of this argument, Mitch and my argument is much more triadic than binaristic. We had to like simplify it for what we're doing here a little bit. But part of what we also are trying to be able to explain in this is how to be able to articulate the different kinds of political protests that emerge out of disasters, right? Because we are seeing protests obviously now both on the both on the left and also on the far right, as well as sort of most places along the middle, I guess. But trying to figure out kind of like how do the perceptual shifts of disaster shape different modes of reaction and resistance across the political spectrum? And what is it that produces the aspirational solidarity that we're talking about? Like, why is it that some modes of protest are organized through aspirational solidarity and some modes are very distinctly not, right? Like, that's part of the question.
And I'll get more wonky on this, right? To talk about two concepts that are in here that are helpful. In a disaster, the perceptual shift that Jordan was talking about, right? Suddenly your eyes are open. We are calling a phenomenon called natality. There's this point after disaster when, because your perception is shifted, there are kind of new births of ideas that you're open to that you weren't before. But that's amoral, right? It's not connected to any kind of political or belief system. There's just an openness because the world has changed. So you're very vulnerable to then what you're exposed to during that time. And so we have this idea called refraction, where then your ideas get refracted by whatever those relationships are that you make in those crucial days or weeks after disaster. So it's a time, for instance, during the pandemic, we've seen the far right extremist groups have really attracted a lot of folks, because when you're in this shaken up place, you're vulnerable for both areas. So that's why this positive aspirational futurism that Jordan described is like so important. Because if you don't get anchored in something that is communitarian and aspirational, you can get anchored in something that is really violent and disruptive. And so that's where it's not even binary. Everybody's going on this journey, and those journeys can lead to kind of 1,000 different places.
Yeah, because and I think it's also worth noting that the nostalgia itself is a kind of response to natality, right? People who, you know, would not necessarily have thought of themselves as really committed to the established order of things can actually become more committed to the established institutional order through that openness of disaster, right? So it's sort of like this phenomenon where everybody gets shaken up so much, right? Like all of the structures that you depend on fall away. And so all of the assumptions that shape your world get challenged. And so the question is like, what new knowledges do you produce through that? And part of what Mitch and I are also trying to track is like, what epistemic practices and habits, like what kind of a knower were you coming into the disaster, and how does that impact your experience of natality? With the understanding that depending on how the disaster hits you, it may totally change your epistemic practices, or it may harden them in various ways. And trying to figure out how and why that happens is like a central part of what we're trying to figure out.
I really like the addition of those two terms and that clarification. I just want to be clear, I was not at all arguing against the aspirational model that you're setting up here. I was just thinking about things that might get in the way of that model, right? Because that's the model we want to push towards, right? And the way in which the sort of chaos of everybody going in 1,000 directions might put pressure on that.
Yeah, and I think it's important, like that's part of why I think theorizing disasters is so generative, is that it is chaos. And so there just are so many, especially in a disaster on this scale, there are so many moving pieces that trying to craft some kind of conceptual apparatus to understand what's going on is I mean, chaos is absolutely the right term for sort of like what it is you're trying to theorize. Yeah. John, you have a question.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
So as somebody who studies American political thought, I would say that our society is extraordinarily susceptible to narratives of nostalgia. I would say, we're not the only society, but we very strongly seem to respond to this, right, historically. So I guess one of the things I'm wondering about is how much your analysis you feel is meant to fit into the sort of contours of American political culture, and how much you feel that it's sort of a more universal argument about the concepts that you've laid out more broadly.
Oh.
Here, let me take this one. So, the Michelle Dauber's sympathetic state is a really good historical treatment of disaster relief legislation in the country and how that led into the New Deal stuff that I was mentioning before. And so this thing about having an idealized past where everybody was this kind of band of brothers who are all farmer patriots, and we're going to lift you up if you get knocked down, and anybody that we think is outside that circle has no meaning. Like that's a very American exceptionalist kind of thing. And so the initial grounding of nostalgia, I think, is very American. the thing about it is that what we see in other places is this settler colonialism argument, where other places that are colonial powers have similar ideas and stratifications of what's happening. So I think it's globalized in that way. But the other thing is, in the last 50 years, the United States has really exported its model of disaster response. So whereas a lot of people had more communitarian models, now FEMA is a global best practice and people are copying the logics that we use. So you can see in places like Australia or the UK, or even in Eastern Europe and parts of Africa, people are moving towards this kind of FEMA recovery model, and they're moving away from a more sort of humanitarian, human rights and responsibility-based model.
Yeah, and the thing I want to add to that is that, you know, part of what Mitch and I are arguing is that when a disaster happens and all of your perceptions are up in the air, one of the things we need most emergently is sort of like a narrative to hang everything on, right? And the dominant American disaster imaginary, which is the term that Mitch and I are using for this, is sort of the state of nature social contract imaginary, right? Because that is our foundational imaginary. So if you look at the way in which we tell stories of disasters in, you know, action movies and other kinds of cultural products, we have this kind of like, you know, we tell disaster stories because it allows us to have like the lone hero charging through this urban state of nature, you know, kind of like, you know, like, and that's a deeply American story. Like there's a way that disasters have become the way that we replay our founding narrative, right? Like disaster stories are our new like cowboys and Indians stories, right? And so part of what we're interested in is how the kind of foundational imaginary is part of what's shaping our understanding of what a disaster is. And you'll notice that embedded in that is a part of what disaster response becomes then is like, you know, a call for like a new social contract, which we've seen across, you know, all kinds of mediums in the pandemic, right? That the pandemic calls for a new social contract, and it's explicitly using this foundational narrative. So I think that when Mitch says the American logics of disaster are they have particular uptake in other settler colonial states, you know, part of that is because of this like this origin story, right? This state of nature origin story. But through our practices of culturally imagining disasters, through action movies, TV, other things like that, we are exporting that narrative culturally. So we are giving other places with different foundational narratives, sort of our conception, our cultural conception of disaster to hang the emergent experience of disaster onto, if that makes sense. So I do think that it is a product of American exceptionalism, but it is also now a kind of American export, and is reshaping what we take disasters to be around the world. And I will just add to that. I mean, for those of you that are interested, part of our project is also, you know, if the dominant disaster imaginary is this like state of nature thing, part of what we're looking for are sort of what are the alternative disaster imaginaries that are emerging. And so, for example, Octavia Butler's book, Parable of the Sower, is newly on the New York Times bestseller list. And that is a kind of alternate disaster imaginary that we are being offered, right? And it is part of what's been called maroon logics, or marronage, as Neil Roberts has put it, right? Which is grounded in the story of kind of slaves escaping slavery and forming emergent communities of survival. And we're arguing that is a different logic of the state of nature, right? A different story that you can tell that might give us a different way of making sense of what disaster is. And so this question of like, what are the imaginaries that we surround ourselves with that become our first tools that we pick up when the disaster happens to make sense of what it is? And so I think that you know, Butler's book gaining this kind of notoriety is in part because people are desperately seeking, right? We're seeking this now that breeds futures. We're seeking new ways of imagining what a disaster is. And so I find a lot of hope in that. In terms of the possibility that we might, in the magnitude of this disaster, begin to rethink the possibilities of what disasters are. Marshall, yes, I'm so glad you used the word ecosystem in your
Right.
question. That is central to what we're doing. A huge part of our project is thinking about disasters as shaping epistemic ecosystems. So for like my philosophy nerds out there, that's really what we're looking at, is because, and this comes back to Ashley's first question, it's not a binary, right? The only way to kind of understand interactions in the state of chaos is as this complex ecosystem. As a way of reshaping exactly what we think the disaster imaginary is. Yeah.
Because part of it is, and I know we're out of time, so I'll just to maybe close with this. If you look at this ecologically, ecosystems have a life cycle, right? They're destroyed and created all the time. And so similarly, disasters do that to some of our information ecosystems. So the question of aspirational solidarity is, in an ecosystem, imagine a forest fire, right? You don't want to burn down the entire forest when you change it, right? You want to be able to, with intention, know what to keep and what to let go of. And so that's why, yeah, I think reshaping the imaginary in intentional ways is the thing that's important to do.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you guys all so much. This was actually our first time presenting this together. Mm-hmm. So we're super excited that you all came to talk with us about it. And we'd be happy to continue the conversation if anybody wants to reach out. So thank you all for being here.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you. This was really interesting.
Thank you for coming, Marshall. Yeah.